Gamer. Hey everyone, Hakias here, and welcome to the new, improved, and rebooted From the Hawk site. I'm the Hawk, these are my eyes, and this is how I see things. So this is basically just a series of videos where I critique mostly modern, but whatever media I'm consuming. Videos, anime, TV shows, movies, books, video games, whatever. If I'm consuming it, I'm usually thinking about it, and I have some thoughts about it, I have some analysis, and I want to share that with you. So that's what this is for. And before I start doing that again, I wanted to go ahead and provide some context for how I think about things and some of my rules for storytelling and for criticism. Both. They're just kind of mixed in all together here. I didn't really separate them out very well. I've got 7 of them. They're in no particular order. And let me just, let me just go ahead and go through these. These are all very important to me in both the art of storytelling and criticism. And I think they probably should be important to everyone if you want to think critically about stories. But, your mileage may vary. That's fine. So here are my 7 rules for storytelling and for criticism of storytelling. Number 1. Like in all art, there are objective and subjective qualities to writing. Try to see both. Number 2, whether a character is well written or not is independent of their moral alignment or your personal preference, right? Number 3, characters should drive plots, not vice versa. Number 4, there are more to the stakes of a story than death. Number 5, there exists an unspoken contract between writer and audience known as the suspension of disbelief. The audience agrees to pretend the things the writer says are true and valid so long as the writer gives them a good reason. What constitutes a good reason can and will vary from genre to genre and story to story. Number 6, story beats should exist to impact the story. The audience should be impacted through the story. And finally, number 7, stories deserve to be judged on their intent as well as their execution. So I'm going to kind of go through these in order of how I've listed them. Like I said, these are my rules for both storytelling and for criticism. So take that for what you will. This is what if you haven't followed these rules, then I question whether you've written a good story. And this is how I will judge it. But before I tell you, I'm going to want to give you some specific examples. You can understand exactly what I mean when I give you these rules. I want to warn you that there are spoilers, because I'm going to give some specific examples. I try to be as generic as possible when giving these examples, but of course, sometimes that can't be helped. So, spoilers follow for several stories, including the movie Serenity, the TV series Game of Thrones through season 7, and that includes the book series A Song of Ice and Fire, because they do share some elements, Avengers Infinity War, the Harry Potter series, and the TV series on the CW called The Flash. So if you're worried about being spoiled for any of those things, turn back now. I've warned you as thoroughly as I know how. So that's it. Just, don't be here anymore. Go watch something else and come back when you're not worried about being spoiled for those things anymore. If you're still here, I assume you're cool with the spoilers, and let's go on. So, number 1, like all art, there are objective and subjective qualities to writing. Try to see both. So, let's talk about The Grapes of Wrath for a minute. This book is often considered an American classic, and it's taught in many schools. I was required to read it in high school myself. The book has a lot of objectively good qualities. It tells an important story from a pivotal period in the history of the United States. It uses a lot of allegory in order to convey points and encourages the reader to learn to look beyond the raw text. There's famously an entire chapter about a turtle trying to cross a busy highway, which is supposed to foreshadow the journey of the story's main characters and serves as an example of that allegory that I just mentioned that is easy to reference. But I really, really, really hate this book just so much. It just wallows in depression, and I get it that it's about the Great Depression and it's a very depressing period, but I like my stories to serve as a form of escapism, and being reminded about how much the world can suck sometimes, doesn't really accomplish that goal. So objectively, the story has a lot going for it, but subjectively, it doesn't work for me at all. I do not enjoy it. On the flip side, the 1998 film Lost in Space. So this was a reboot of a beloved campy 60s science fiction TV series about a family that, well, they get lost in space, and the wacky hijinks that ensue. The movie takes a slightly more serious tone in some ways, and frankly, it's awful. The acting, despite some pretty famous and talented actors, is pretty wooden. There's a battle for tone between the actual story being told, which is actually kind of campy, along the same as the original series, and everything else in the movie, from the dark lighting and the stony-faced actors and some of the tense music. Objectively, the movie just is a wreck. It doesn't know what it's doing, and it doesn't know where it's going, and it shows. But I love this movie. I don't care that no one quite seems to know what they're trying to do. When Morgan from The Walking Dead shouts, "This Cold War just got hot," it may be factually incorrect and somewhat inappropriate, but I still shout laugh every single time. It brings me joy. So just because what you're supposed to get from this is just because you personally dislike something doesn't mean it has no redeeming quality. And just because you love it doesn't mean that anyone involved with its creation knew what they were doing. It's important to see the good and the bad. It's also important to let people enjoy things. You can come at me and tell me how terrible Lost in Space movie is as much as you want, and it's never going to make me stop loving the movie. It's just going to make me like you less. So when you're criticizing, it's important to, I guess, kind of know your audience and speak to them. And if they don't want to hear about how terrible it is because they love it, then leave them alone. That's a big important thing. Number 2, whether a character is well written or not is independent of both their moral alignment and your personal preference. So this one is pretty straightforward. Just because a character is evil doesn't mean they aren't well written, or that they shouldn't be well written. Like, you don't get to have a poorly written evil character just because they're evil. Also, as with stories in general, just because you like or dislike a character doesn't make them well written. For example, Joffrey from Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, is a terrific example. I despise him. I can find no redeeming qualities in him. I don't even love to hate him. The very thought of his existence disgusts me. But damn, if Jack Gleason, his acting and George R.R. Martin's writing of the character is just so spot on, so good that you can't help but respect the talent that is involved in the creation of this character, both in the books and in the TV series. It really could have just easily become, especially with the writing, the way they changed the writing in the TV series, he could have just become like a terrifying cartoon character. But the acting was so good, and the original writing was so good that they avoid that. Number 3, characters should drive plots, not vice versa. Most of the time when a character acts illogically, they're acting outside of the bounds of what we've been told and shown about them, to the point that it makes it difficult for the audience to continue suspending their disbelief. Often this is done by writers who have a certain plot they want to push forward, but they can't figure out how to accomplish it without making someone do something out of character for them. For example, Barry Allen in the CW's The Flash. For at least the first 3 seasons, he is shown to be an exceptionally intelligent and caring guy. His first instinct upon accidentally being gifted superhuman powers is to use them to protect others. Even before that, he'd committed himself to a life as a forensics investigator to help protect people. And he's presented generally as nearly a super genius, both in his career and outside of it. Unfortunately, a recurring theme throughout the the series has been his falling in love with various women and refusing to tell them about his superpowers. This, in and of itself, isn't bad. There are lots of good reasons not to tell them. But the writers are so intent on showing us how noble he is that every time this happens, he insists that he's doing it to protect them. Barry is too smart to not realize that he's actually putting them in more danger by not telling them, especially since on more than one occasion, a supervillain has found out about his true identity and tried to get at him through a love interest. Had they known what the villains ended up finding out, they might have been able to protect themselves better, or at least been able to make an informed decision about what continuing to associate with Barry/The Flash would mean for their long-term prospects. I find it infuriating for the writers to keep shoving this plot point at us again and again, long after it stopped making even an iota of sense. In real life, do people act illogically? Absolutely. But it's one of those things that never seems to translate well into stories. So if you're writing a story where a character has to act outside of what would generally be considered reasonable or out of their character, be very careful lest you fall into this trap. Number 4. There are more to the stakes of a story than death. I feel like ever since Game of Thrones aired, it could have started earlier, but definitely since then, many writers have started feeling like they need to kill important characters in order to really have stakes in their story. The idea of killing characters to drive home the direness of a given situation is hardly a new concept, of course. The original Star Trek famously had security officers, known for their red shirts, die at the start of an alarming number of episodes in order to prove that the stakes were high, and they were far from the only show to attempt this kind of storytelling. So really this new trend is just that old one on steroids, but putting it on steroids doesn't actually make it work any better. You can kill 1 million people in your story, but if you don't put it in the right context, it's not going to do anything for your plot, your characters, or your audience. On the flip side of this coin, some people seem to argue that a character resurrection automatically removes all stakes from a story. After all, they reason, if death isn't necessarily permanent, then how can anything matter? While a poorly written character resurrection can be problematic, a well-written one can do so much with the resurrection that it complicates the story further, or at least changes character perspectives. It's also important to place a resurrection into context so that the audience can understand when they should and shouldn't expect one to be possible, which means other character deaths can still be impactful. For example, let's look at Avengers Infinity War. Many characters die throughout the course of this story. Some of them are placed in a context where it becomes obvious that they're probably not coming back, while some are placed in a context where they are coming back, so you can have a certain kind of emotional impact from that first set of deaths. And even in the second set of deaths, you get an emotional impact by watching the way the various characters react and feel about those character deaths. This is obviously changing and impacting their world, even when you know that those characters are going to end up coming back. There is more to a given story, after all, than who is alive or dead at the end of it. Even in a show like Game of Thrones, where there is an extraordinary amount of interest in who will still be alive at the end, there are other elements in play. Will the various characters achieve their goals? Who will sit on the Iron Throne? Who will hook up with whom, and how long will it stick? There's just so much more to the disposition of the story than who lives or dies. And once you realize that, it seems silly to suggest that simply reviving characters or killing characters is the only way to judge the stakes of a story. Number 5. There exists an unspoken contract between writer and audience known as the suspension of disbelief. The audience agrees to pretend the things the writer says are true and valid, so long as the writer gives them a good reason. What constitutes a good reason can and will vary from genre to genre and story to story. So in the penultimate episode of Season 7 of Game of Thrones, there was a ridiculous sequence of events which, while spoiling as little as possible, required a man to run what had been several days' march to reach help. The help consisted of releasing a messenger raven to deliver the plea to a location more than 1,000 miles distant, and resulted in help arriving back at the starting point of this misadventure in the form of dragonflight. The problem isn't necessarily the sequence of events necessarily. The problem is that it appeared to take place in a single night. This is terrible writing or terrible editing. Perhaps the editing comes in and perhaps these events took place over more than one night, but that would actually raise its own issues in regard to the storytelling as well. When one of the crew members was asked about the fan backlash to this sequence, he replied, I'm paraphrasing, "You're watching a TV show with dragons in it, and you're going to complain about how fast a raven can fly? I don't believe people actually have a problem with this." He acts as though the inclusion of one fantastic element means that the rules of logic and reason should no longer apply at all. Of course, if that were true, then our dead heroes should have just deflected the swords, arrows, and knives and bolts directed at them before tearing off their winter furs to expose their red and blue undergarments and soaring into the sky. That would be ridiculous, of course, but so is what happened, and especially ridiculous is this creator's reaction. When a writer builds a world, they get to define the rules for that world. By default, audience members are going to assume that it's like the world they are familiar with. This doesn't mean that your story has to have all of the elements of the real world, but it does mean that you have to define what those differences are so that they know what to believe and what to expect and what is possible and what is still impossible. Game of Thrones defines itself as different from both the real world and other medieval fantasy, and similar to others with the inclusion of dragons. Throughout the course of the stories, we learn what these dragons can and cannot do. For example, they're not talking dragons like in Dragonheart, but they're more like extremely intelligent dogs with a few magical instincts that no one really understands all that well. We've learned this throughout the course of the story. Because of this, we accept the dragons as parts of this universe. We suspend our disbelief as to their existence. Other denizens of this universe include ravens. They appear to be no different from the ravens we're used to in our own world. Without any implication or expression that they are somehow different, the audience is reasonably going to assume that they are not different. A normal raven is not capable of flying 1,000 miles in a single night. When you show me a sequence of events that requires me to believe that must have happened without giving me any reason to believe that it could have, you have failed as a writer, either in your definition of a raven or in your description of events. The suspension of disbelief contract is vital to the telling of any story. No one should take seriously the criticisms of an individual about Game of Thrones if they center around the fact that dragons aren't real. The writers have given us enough information to accept that they are for the purposes of the story, but the creator owes the audience that fair reason for everything that happens. They don't get to drop the Starship Enterprise into low orbit over Westeros in the series finale and beam everyone to safety without giving the audience any reason to think that that could be a thing that happened in the universe. Of course, different types of stories have different definitions of fair reason in their contracts. Game of Thrones is a fairly serious story, and so it has a high bar to clear. Kids' movies and other sillier entertainment doesn't need to try quite so hard to keep things consistent because the audience isn't there for a consistent story, they're just there for a laugh. This is why I would never pick apart details and say Cars or Monty Python and the Holy Grail, as I often have in Game of Thrones or Star Trek Discovery. Number 6. Story beats should exist to impact the story. The audience should be impacted through the story. So this is one of the ways in which Joss Whedon drives me absolutely nuts as a writer. One of his signature moves is to unexpectedly kill a character so as to shock the audience, usually without even bothering to make a token effort to make it have anything to do with the story at all. You can see this in everything he's written, from Serenity to Avengers to Age of Ultron. In Serenity, for example, he kills Wash with a random flying object just as audience members thought he was safe. It happens so late in the story that the characters don't even really have time to register it beyond initial shock and dismay. It certainly doesn't complete a character arc, because completing a character arc would mean that the audience could see it coming. J.K. Rowling pulled a similar stunt in her final Harry Potter book, in which she killed multiple major side characters off-screen and, in several cases, didn't even reveal those deaths until the story was over. Pro tip: your character deaths can't impact the story if they're not revealed until after the story. J.K. just wanted to make her audience sad. Misappropriated story beats often occur when writers want to set up a plot twist too, but they don't know how to do it well. One infamous example is from season 7 of Game of Thrones, where several scenes occurred between Sansa and Arya Stark in order to set up one of the final twists of the season. The scenes don't make any sense, though, once you realize that no one was there to witness them except for the audience, so they didn't have any purpose. This kind of writing almost always leaves your audience feeling like the writers think they're stupid. Making your audience think you look down on them is not a good way to keep them coming back for more. And finally, number 7. Stories deserve to be judged on their intent as well as execution. A bad story is a bad story. Like everything in life, results matter. But like most things in life, intent matters too, at least a little bit. When someone takes a risk in the method or content of their story, they deserve to be recognized for that effort, even if the execution was flawed. A game like Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep takes a huge risk in the way it tells its story. It's not always well done, but the method was innovative and interesting. Star Trek, the original series, attempts to take some progressive social values and present them on screen. It doesn't always 100% hit the mark. There are definitely some issues that a modern audience will take with it, but given its time and context, the attempt was innovative and deserves to be recognized as such. So that's it. That's way too many words and too much of your time explaining my approach to criticism in media. Hopefully you learned something about me, something about yourself, or at least something about criticism while you were watching. I feel like I had to do this before I could get into some of the more in-depth critical thinking video essays I want to do, so I that's why it's here. So it's okay if you don't agree with everything that you heard or saw, but I wanted to make sure that you had the proper context to place the things that I will say later and honestly have said before, so that you can understand where I'm coming from, and hopefully that helps it make a little bit more sense. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, I hope you have a beautiful day, and may all of your paths be paved with hexagonal stones. Here's a quick shout out to all of my patrons. For as little as $1 a month, you too can have your name listed here. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons to help me reach more people.